The sea that night was black and restless. Wind tore white streaks across the swells, and spray lashed the bridge windows of the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Hobson DD-464 as she held her station on the starboard quarter of Convoy HX-233, 40 merchantmen clawing their way eastward toward the British Isles. The moon had sunk hours earlier. What light remained came from the green glow of the radar scope and the dim red bulbs above the plotting table. Beyond the bulkheads, the Atlantic was absolute darkness. At 2:40 hours, the captain, Lieutenant Commander Harold G. Meeker, scribbled a single line in his private logbook. We could hear propeller pulses, but see nothing. For the last hour, his sonar operators had been reporting intermittent contacts, slow rhythmic cavitations echoing through the deep too irregular for a whale, too deliberate for current noise. Each time the destroyer swung to investigate, the signal faded into static. Somewhere beneath the convoy, a German U-boat stalked them, invisible. By the spring of 1943, this scene had repeated across the North Atlantic thousands of times. The Allies, despite their growing convoy fleets and radar advances, remained half-blind in darkness. U-boats, armed with the new Metox radar detector and operating mostly at night, could approach convoys on the surface, fire, and dive before any escort sighted them. The British called those attacks the Midnight Massacres. Conventional sonar, then known as ASDIC, was nearly useless once a submarine submerged deeply or operated beneath thermal layers. Radar, the new hope of surface commanders, was temperamental and crude. Its signals broke on sea clutter, rain squalls, and the heavy roll of Atlantic waves. Operators often mistook crests for echoes, yet it was radar that offered the first glimmer of salvation, a way to see beyond the night, to strike the unseen. Meeker's destroyer carried the American SG radar, a 10-centimeter microwave set developed only months before. Unlike older metric wave units, SG radar could, in theory, detect a submarine's conning tower or periscope head at several miles, even in darkness. In practice, however, the sea conspired against precision. On April nights like this, wind force 6, visibility 0, the screen became a storm of ghosts. Radar men learned to distrust their eyes. A single spark on the cathode ray tube could be a wave, a cloud, or an enemy periscope, and the German Navy had grown equally adept at deception. The Metox device aboard U-boats warned them when Allied radar was active, allowing captains to dive minutes before being detected. A strange duel emerged, one of electrons rather than shells. At 3:10, sonar reported contact again. Bearing green 090, range 1,200 yards, Doppler closing. The destroyer turned hard to starboard, screws thrashing the sea white. The bearing held steady, then faded. Meeker clenched his jaw. The convoy steamed on. Somewhere beyond the curtain of night, a torpedo might already be in the water. By dawn, no ship had been lost. The escort group had dropped 24 depth charges with no confirmed kill. When Hobson refueled at Argentia 2 days later, Meeker filed his official report. Enemy evaded under cover of darkness. Radar failed to provide reliable surface contact. The language was dry, bureaucratic, far from the frustration written in his private log. Across the Atlantic, similar reports filled British and American archives that spring. Despite the massive technological advantage the Allies were building, U-boat sinkings remained sporadic. The gap was not in courage or effort, it was in perception. The ocean was a medium of deception, and the night belonged to the submariner. The Royal Navy's scientific advisers began to suspect the issue was not range, but interpretation. In one memorandum, dated 12th April 1943, Commander E.R.M. Johns of the Admiralty Signals Establishment wrote, "Our radar may see them, but not know it. The returns are buried within the sea's own echoes. If we could manipulate these reflections, perhaps enhance certain waveforms, we might trick the U-boat into exposing itself." That suggestion, buried in the annex of an otherwise routine report, would become the seed of what destroyer men later called the crazy radar hack. The hack was not a device in itself, but an exploitation, a twisting of radar's limitations into an advantage. British technicians had discovered that U-boat radar detectors were overly sensitive to certain pulse frequencies. If an Allied radar set deliberately modulated its frequency or emitted at a pattern mimicking ship clutter, it could produce phantom echoes. To the U-boat operator, these ghosts looked like multiple vessels approaching from odd bearings, prompting the submarine to adjust course or even surface to confirm. In those brief moments, destroyer radar could catch the real silhouette. The idea first circulated informally among British coastal radar units and American electronics officers in the spring of 1943. It was half rumour, half experiment. Some claimed the method originated from a radar officer aboard HMS Duke of York, who noticed that changing the transmitter valve temperature altered echo patterns enough to confuse enemy detectors. Others credited US engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory for discovering that slightly dirty signals, those with harmonic noise, could jam or mislead the Metox receivers. Whatever its true parentage, the technique spread quietly through Allied escort commands. Official documents referred to it simply as Radar Countermeasure Type 271X. In destroyer wardrooms, it was called the Ghost Signal. Captain Meeker heard of it weeks later, while his ship underwent maintenance at Boston Navy Yard. A British liaison officer, Lieutenant Commander William Garnett, briefed him over coffee in the officers' mess. "Think of it as feeding the wolf false meat," Garnett said. "We broadcast just enough of a signal to make their detectors sing. They think they're safe, blind to our bearing, but in truth we're painting them the whole time." Meeker was skeptical. "You're saying we can use our radar to make them come up?" "Not quite willingly," Garnett smiled, "but they'll move. And when they do, we'll see them." That conversation, logged later in the 339th Fighter Squadron's sister file on joint radar projects, marked the informal beginning of night hunting doctrine, an evolution of radar warfare from passive detection to active deception. By summer, a handful of destroyers were fitted with modified SG sets capable of pulse variation. Crews trained to interpret the faint shifting blips that might signal a U-boat breaking surface. For the first time, radar became not merely an eye, but a lure. The transformation was subtle, and in April 1943 no one aboard the Hobson could yet imagine it. That night, as Meeker's crew secured from action stations and the horizon began to pale grey, a single thought lingered among the watch officers. They had fought ghosts. Ghosts on the sonar, ghosts on the radar, ghosts in the Black Atlantic. In months to come, those ghosts would take form, and for the hunted submariners, they would become deadly real. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had entered a strange equilibrium. The Allies had learned to survive, but not yet to dominate. Convoys were reaching Britain in growing numbers, yet U-boats still prowled the mid-ocean gap, the Black Pit, as sailors called it, beyond range of shore-based aircraft. There, in the hours before dawn, the submarines struck with unnerving precision. It was in that season of attrition that a handful of engineers in the British Admiralty began to twist desperation into innovation. The most curious among them was Lieutenant Commander Arthur McElroy, a wiry man with spectacles always smudged by graphite, whose narrow office overlooked the damp courtyards of the Admiralty Signals establishment at Haslemere. His file survives in the National Archives under the prosaic heading Experimental Countermeasures, CM/23/43. In the margin of one memo, written in his uneven hand, are 5 words that would later describe the entire radar deception effort. Use their ears against them. McElroy was not a career sailor, but a former physics lecturer from King's College, pulled into uniform in 1940 when radar became Britain's secret weapon. By 1943, he had grown restless with the slow pace of doctrinal approval. "We were chasing echoes with the speed of a glacier," he wrote later in a private letter to his wife. The submarines had the initiative. "We had only our mathematics." At the Admiralty, he worked under Commander E.J. Purvis, head of radar development, whose reports now sit preserved in the Naval History and Heritage Command Archives, HGram 018. It was Purvis who authorized McElroy's proposal to conduct live experimentation with modified transmission frequencies aboard operational destroyers. The phrase sounded mundane, but its implications were radical. Radar, in its essence, was a dialogue between sender and receiver, a steady rhythm of pulses reflecting from metal and sea. McElroy wondered what might happen if that rhythm were slightly wrong. If a destroyer's radar beam fluctuated irregularly, could it confuse the enemy's primitive detectors? Could an electronic stutter become a weapon? The opportunity came in June, when HMS Tumult, a British tribal-class destroyer preparing for escort duty, was fitted with an experimental 10-centimetre Type 271 radar. McElroy, posing as a technical observer, boarded her at Scapa Flow with a suitcase of vacuum tubes and a note authorizing temporary interference with ship's radar circuitry. The sailors gave him a nickname almost immediately, Sparky. What he built on Tumult's plotting room table was little more than a switchbox wired to the magnetron's control grid. By manually adjusting the pulse repetition frequency, he could make the radar emit a deliberately dirty signal, oscillating just enough to resemble natural sea clutter. When broadcast into the night, this irregular pulse made the Metox receivers aboard German U-boats wail constantly, indistinguishable from the background hiss of ocean noise. In late June, Tumult sailed north with Convoy JW-57, bound for Murmansk. McElroy kept a daily log, later declassified by the Air Force Historical Research Agency. On 23 June, he noted, "German surface radar warning apparently silent for several hours. Later reports from intelligence suggest U-boats surfaced unusually close to Convoy." At the time, the link was circumstantial. Yet within weeks, similar observations arrived from American escorts operating in the Atlantic. The U.S. Navy's USS Buckley DE-51 reported an encounter where an unidentified submarine surfaced within 1,500 yards at night, seemingly unaware of approaching radar beams until it was too late. The destroyer escort rammed and sank it after a brief firefight. When those reports reached Haslemere, McElroy felt vindicated. He drafted a confidential circular titled "On the Inducement of U-Boat Exposure by Pulse Modulation." Only 8 copies were printed, one of which, stamped secret and numbered 3/8, was forwarded to the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory in Washington. A reply came weeks later from Commander Ralph Bowen, confirming that American SG radar operators had noticed similar false calm effects when their sets malfunctioned at low voltages. Bowen's letter concluded with a cautious line. "It appears possible that certain faults in our equipment may be useful if properly understood." Thus, the crazy radar hack gained its first transatlantic legitimacy. Still, the idea remained controversial. Many in the Royal Navy distrusted anything that could not be measured directly. "The sea is full of ghosts already," complained Captain G.C. Dickens of the escort group B5. Now these boffins wish to add more. Admiralty Board minutes from July 1943 show skepticism. Until such methods can produce verifiable results under combat conditions, no operational reliance shall be placed on deliberate frequency corruption. But radar operators, the young men sitting in dark rooms staring at green screens for hours, understood intuitively what McElroy was trying to achieve. They had seen how the ocean could trick their machines. If they could trick the ocean back, even once, it might save a convoy. In August, McElroy joined an American delegation to the Naval Research Laboratory, travelling under a combined Chiefs of Staff exchange program. There he met physicist Dr. Luis Alvarez, who was studying airborne radar jamming for bomber formations. Alvarez's notebooks, now in the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum archives, mention British naval liaison proposes controlled clutter emission to induce U-boat reaction. The two men spent 3 nights in the lab experimenting with pulse sequences on captured German Metox units. Their results were crude but promising. When the signal's pulse width fluctuated between 1.0 and 1.5 microseconds at irregular intervals, the Metox receiver's warning tone oscillated wildly, producing what Alvarez described as a panic chorus in the operator's earphones. Prolonged exposure forced German radar men to shut down their sets to preserve hearing, leaving their submarines effectively blind. That August, the Allied Naval Countermeasures Committee classified the discovery under codename Project Hornpipe. The details were kept secret even from most escort captains. A handful of destroyers, 3 British, 2 American, were modified with hornpipe switches by September. Their orders were to test the new pulse sequences only during confirmed radar contact events and to record U-boat reactions. For McElroy, it was a vindication mixed with unease. "We are fighting not just with depth charges," he wrote to a colleague, "but with illusions. The enemy hears us where we are not. In a war of tonnage and steel, it was an idea bordering on heresy. Yet the first combat trial, Operation Nightstalk, was already being planned. Soon those illusions would be tested against the real hunters of the Atlantic." The convoy known as HX-233 sailed from Halifax under an iron-grey sky, its columns of merchantmen stretching for miles, a slow-moving procession of steel and hope. Each ship carried what Britain needed to survive: wheat, oil, ammunition, machine parts. Around them, the sea heaved with a deceptive calm. To the untrained eye, it was just another crossing. But to a handful of men aboard HMS Tumult, it was a laboratory for the strangest experiment yet attempted in the Battle of the Atlantic. Arthur McElroy stood in the destroyer's radar shack, headphones pressed to his ears, the green glow of the Type 271 scope flickering across his face. He wasn't supposed to be there anymore. His official role was technical observer, but after weeks at sea, the crew treated him like one of their own. His makeshift hornpipe device, a small wooden box with 2 dials and a toggle switch, was wired directly into the radar's pulse control circuit. To the captain, Lieutenant Commander Hugh Denholm, it looked like wizardry. "If that box of yours makes the Krauts deaf," he told McElroy that night, "I'll have it gilded and mounted on the bridge." McElroy smiled faintly. "Let's hope it just confuses them enough to surface." The convoy steamed eastward, guarded by 4 destroyers and 6 corvettes. Somewhere beyond the radar horizon, Admiral Dönitz's U-boat packs, Seawolf and Leopard, waited. Intelligence from decrypted Enigma traffic suggested they were converging from the north, but this time the escorts were not entirely blind. Tumult had been equipped with the new hornpipe modulation, while the American destroyer escort USS Janssen carried a prototype built at the Naval Research Lab, tuned to slightly different frequencies. On the evening of September 17th, as the sun bled into the horizon, McElroy began recording baseline readings. The radar hummed at 10 centimeters, pulses steady at 500 per second. On the headphones, the sea returned its usual rhythm, a soft, constant whisper. Then, with a flick of his thumb, McElroy threw the toggle. The beam began to stutter. The pulse frequency wandered just enough to create a wavering interference pattern, invisible on their own scope, but devastating to any Metox receiver within range. The sound that reached German ears, if theory held, would be a maddening warble. Too steady to be dismissed as static, too chaotic to locate. For hours, nothing happened. The convoy ploughed east through rough seas. Rain swept the decks, and the bridge lights dimmed under blackout orders. Then, at 0200, a radar operator aboard Tumult called out, "Contact! Bearing 037, range 9,000 yards." The trace flickered faintly on the scope, something small breaking the surface for a moment. McElroy froze. Captain Denholm barked, "Helm, bring us 10 degrees starboard. Prepare to illuminate." But before the order was completed, the contact vanished. Then, astonishingly, reappeared, closer this time. McElroy adjusted the dial on his box. "Increase modulation. Now." The pulses thickened. Seconds later, another contact appeared on a parallel bearing, then another. Phantom echoes. False targets, blooming across the display. "What the devil?" Denholm muttered. "It's not us, sir," McElroy said quietly. "It's them. Their radar men are reacting. They're surfacing to verify what they think they're hearing." The next moment proved him right. Through the mist, Tumult's lookouts spotted a periscope wake barely 1,000 yards ahead. Denholm shouted, "Hard a port! Depth charges. Pattern 5. The sea erupted. The concussion hammered the hull, and a column of water rose behind the destroyer. Moments later, an oil slick surfaced, thin, rainbow-coloured, unmistakable. Over the next hour, 2 more U-boats appeared briefly on radar before diving again. Janssen, patrolling the southern flank, reported a similar pattern. Multiple brief radar contacts, suspect U-boats breaking surface erratically, possibly disoriented. In Washington, the reports that followed would be labelled Hornpipe Alpha test results. To the sailors of Tumult, it was something else entirely, a night of ghost chasing. The destroyer's log simply read, "U-boat contact confirmed. Explosion heard. Oil sighted. No survivors recovered." But for McElroy, it was the first proof that controlled chaos could be weaponized. By creating a synthetic ocean noise field, they had lured U-boats into revealing themselves. A week later, decrypted Enigma messages confirmed the effect. A transmission from U-617, intercepted by Bletchley Park, complained of persistent British radar interference causing unbearable signal distortion in receiver sets. Metox officers unable to determine bearing. Recommend shutting down apparatus to avoid confusion. That same night, U-617 was sunk off the Moroccan coast by Allied aircraft, her radar silent, her crew unaware of their hunters overhead. When the Admiralty reviewed the results, reactions were mixed. Commander Purvis wrote cautiously, "Preliminary indications suggest tactical utility." Further experimentation warranted under controlled engagement parameters, but McElroy, exhausted and elated, wrote something far less formal in his personal notes. "For the first time, we have turned their fear of detection into blindness." The news spread quietly through the escort fleet. Crews called it the ghost tune. Some claimed the Germans could hear the singing radar even when they couldn't see ships. In Liverpool taverns, sailors joked that the hornpipe box could make a U-boat lose its ears. But not everyone celebrated. In October, during follow-up trials, one escort's radar malfunctioned catastrophically when its pulse circuit overheated from overuse of the modulation switch. The resulting blackout nearly allowed a U-boat attack on convoy ON-207. Critics within the Admiralty seized on the incident. "Unreliable gadgetry," one memo complained. "The war will not be won by dial-turners." McElroy was recalled to Haslemere for review. There, under the flickering light of the signals establishment's underground bunker, he defended his work before a sceptical board of officers. "Gentlemen," he told them, "the ocean is not quiet, it sings. We have simply learned the tune better than our enemy." Silence followed. Then Purvis spoke. "We'll authorize one more trial. Under combat. You'll have your proof or your obituary." Within weeks, McElroy was bound for another convoy, this time aboard the American escort USS Janssen, bound for Iceland. The next stage of Hornpipe would not be a test, it would be war. The convoy HX-233 was somewhere north of the Azores when the weather turned against them. The sea rose into sharp metallic peaks, and fog rolled low and heavy across the water, turning the horizon into a wall of pale fire. For most captains, it was the kind of night to dread, one where you could lose a ship without hearing a splash. But for Lieutenant Commander Robert Langley of the USS Janssen, this was the kind of night they had been waiting for. McElroy stood beside him on the bridge, clutching a clipboard slick with condensation. The Hornpipe 2 circuit, his improved version of the radar modulation box, was humming in the compartment below, manned by Ensign Wallace, a quiet, mathematically minded Texan who seemed to understand the device as though he'd built it from muscle memory. "Visibility, 200 yards, Langley muttered. "Christ help us if one of those Liberty ships veers off course." "Christ may be helping," McElroy said, "but the math is what'll save us tonight." Langley chuckled. "You and your math." "I prefer depth charges." At 21:40 hours, the first anomaly appeared. Wallace's voice crackled through the sound-powered phones. "Radar Echo, bearing 042, range 10,000 yards. No visual. Repeat, no visual." Langley turned to McElroy. "You think that's one of ours?" "Not unless our ships are crawling now." The fog blanketed the sea, making even nearby escorts invisible. But the radar trace pulsed steadily, just off the convoy's starboard bow. Then suddenly it shifted. Wallace again. "Target bearing shifting 30 degrees north. Contact behaving erratically." McElroy leaned over the radar console, watching the phosphorescent trace flicker. "He's surfacing, then diving again. They're trying to confirm where the emissions are coming from." "Then let's give them something to find," Langley said. He nodded to the operations officer. "Start the modulation." Gentle pulse, two-step phase drift. Wallace adjusted the dial. Deep inside the destroyer's electronic guts, the radar began to sing, its pulse rhythm shifting in tiny, deliberate stumbles. To an enemy's Metox or Naxos radar receiver, the pattern would sound like a series of rising and falling tones, mimicking a ship's echo returning from multiple bearings. To U-boat captains, this was maddening. Their instruments, tuned to sense Allied radar pings, now received echoes that seemed to surround them, phantom ships where none existed. Within minutes, the trap began to work. Aboard U-608, Oberleutnant Kurt Gruber scribbled a frantic note in his log, later recovered by Allied intelligence after the war. "Radar ghosts in every quadrant. Impossible to distinguish real from false. Attempting to surface for bearings. Crew nervous. Believing we are encircled." Gruber's boat surfaced at 22:15, the conning tower breaking through the fog barely 2 miles from the Janssen. The destroyer's radar picked him up instantly. "Target! Range 3,000 yards, Wallace shouted. Langley barked orders. "Bring us around! Hedgehog ready, fire when you have the tone." The Janssen surged forward, her bow splitting the grey water. McElroy braced himself against the bulkhead as the ship heeled hard to port. The gunnery team, soaked to the bone, unleashed a full pattern of Hedgehog mortars, a spread of 24 contact-fused projectiles that arced silently through the fog before plunging into the sea. Seconds later, the night cracked open with 4 near-simultaneous explosions. Then came the roar. The destroyer's bridge windows rattled as a shockwave rippled beneath the hull. Wallace whispered into his microphone, "Radar contact lost." When the fog lifted briefly under the light of a magnesium flare, they saw the evidence: oil, debris, and the shattered casing of a periscope lens. "Got him," Langley said softly. "By God, we got him." McElroy's hands trembled slightly as he noted the time, 22:19 hours. The first confirmed kill using the Hornpipe 2 modulation. The Janssen's deck crew broke into a low cheer, but McElroy felt no triumph. He stared at the radar scope, the false echoes still dancing across the screen like ghosts that refused to rest. "It's strange," he murmured. "We tricked them into seeing what wasn't there." and now they're gone. Langley heard him. That's war, Professor. You blind them before they blind you. Over the following days, the results of the operation reached the Admiralty and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The combined convoy group had passed through the U-boat gauntlet without losing a single merchant ship. Intelligence decrypts indicated 2 confirmed U-boat losses and 3 damaged, none of which had managed to send coherent signals before vanishing. When McElroy's report arrived in London, Commander Purvis wrote in the margin, "Operational viability confirmed. Recommend limited field deployment." The crazy radar hack, once an eccentric experiment, was now a classified weapon. It received a formal name: Type 271X Phase Drift Modulation System. But to the sailors who used it, the nickname Ghost Pulse stuck. And yet success brought new problems. Within weeks, German signals officers began analysing the anomalies. In an intercepted Kriegsmarine memo dated December 2, 1943, the BDU U-Boat Command issued a warning. Enemy destroyers may employ false radar echoes. Submarines are to avoid surfacing when confused by irregular signal strength. Shut down receivers if interference persists. The cat and mouse had evolved. Back in Portsmouth, McElroy returned to his small office, the salt still crusted on his uniform, and listened to the playback recordings captured during Jansen's engagement. The tones were eerie, rising, falling, a mechanical choir whispering through static. "It almost sounds alive," Wallace had said when he'd first heard it. McElroy thought about that often. He knew the Germans would adapt, perhaps even learn to mimic the modulation themselves. The sea had no loyalties, and technology was an opportunist. Still, he allowed himself one small line in his private logbook before the ink ran dry. "We have proven that the dark can be made to speak, and once it speaks, it betrays all who hide within it." Outside, the shipyard lights of Portsmouth flickered against the harbour mist. Beyond them lay the endless Atlantic, black, merciless, and for the first time in years, slightly less haunted. The first weeks of 1944 brought a grim but undeniable change to the war beneath the waves. For the first time since 1941, Allied merchant convoys were crossing the Atlantic with losses counted not in dozens of ships, but in single digits. The U-boat packs, once the terror of the night seas, were shrinking shadows of their former strength. At the Liverpool docks, the cold wind carried the scent of coal smoke, salt, and iron. Within a small brick building near the Admiralty's Western Approaches Command, Arthur McElroy sat hunched over a table littered with graphs and debriefing reports. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Across from him, Commander Purvis set down his pipe. "You realize, McElroy, that these numbers are bordering on the fantastic?" "They're accurate," McElroy replied quietly. "Convoy losses down 70% since October. Confirmed U-boat sinkings, 19 in January alone. Half of those detected and tracked at night." Purvis adjusted his spectacles. "And all this because of your pulse trickery?" "Because of clarity," McElroy said. "For years we hunted in blindness. Now we're turning their night against them. The reports in front of them came from the Western Approaches Tactical Unit and the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet. They were drawn from debriefs, radar logs, and combat reports, meticulously gathered evidence of something extraordinary. Destroyer captains described U-boats surfacing in confusion, disoriented by phantom radar tones. American escort groups off Newfoundland reported that U-boats no longer lingered near convoys. They fled at the first sign of the ghost pulse. One U.S. report, 13 Anti-Submarine Command, April 1944, recorded this entry. Enemy subs increasingly break off engagements under heavy radar interference. Crews report phantom destroyers closing in. Estimated morale degradation among U-boat crews, severe. The statistics confirmed it. Between January and March 1944, the Kriegsmarine lost more than 60 submarines. Fewer than half were sunk by aircraft or depth charges. Many were caught surfacing at night, tracked and cornered by radar alone. Yet for all the triumph in numbers, the human cost still weighed on McElroy. He had returned from sea duty to a desk job, but his nights were sleepless. Sometimes he heard the pulse in his head, the rhythmic hum of radar echoes, the strange song that had led men to their deaths beneath the waves. In March, he was called to a closed meeting at the Admiralty. Around the table sat the architects of Allied naval warfare, Admiral Max Houghton, the commander of the western approaches, several officers from the Royal Navy's Signals Branch, and 2 American observers from the Office of Naval Research. The purpose? Review the future of radar countermeasures before D-Day. Houghton began without ceremony. Gentlemen, the German wolf packs are bleeding. The ghost pulse appears to be the blade. But how long before they adapt? McElroy glanced at the Americans. One of them, Lieutenant Charles Monroe from the Naval Research Lab, spoke first. We've intercepted chatter suggesting the Germans are developing frequency-hopping receivers. They're trying to mask your phase modulation. Purvis frowned. If they succeed, they'll nullify the echo distortion entirely. McElroy interjected. Not entirely. The system relies on their perception, on confusing the operator, not just the receiver. Even if they compensate technically, the psychological effect remains. Houghton raised an eyebrow. Psychological effect? McElroy hesitated, then spoke. When you sit in a steel coffin under 100 feet of water, the sea is absolute darkness. The only light you have comes from your instruments. If those lie to you, if they whisper ghosts into your ears, you begin to distrust the machine. Once that happens, no radar or captain's order will save the boat. The room was silent. Houghton finally nodded. Carry on then. But keep it quiet. The fewer who know the details, the longer we'll have the edge. And so Ghost Pulse, officially Type 271X, remained classified. Its manuals were hand-typed and locked in safes aboard only the most trusted escort ships. Operators were briefed verbally, sworn to secrecy, and told never to discuss the modulation patterns even among their own crews. Meanwhile, deep in the Atlantic, the men of the U-boat arm were unravelling. Allied intercepts from captured German wireless traffic painted a picture of desperation. The BDU's January 1944 situation report lamented, "Enemy night detection has achieved unnatural precision. Boats report radar deception and false signals impossible to interpret. Recommend retreat to northern routes until countermeasures complete." But the countermeasures never fully came. The Allied radar network had become too powerful, too coordinated. With long-range patrol bombers equipped with Lee lights and centimetre-wave radar, and destroyer escorts now wielding McElroy's modulation hack, the Atlantic, once the graveyard of Allied shipping, was turning into a hunting ground. By February, some convoys reached Liverpool without a single loss. A Royal Navy signal officer, Lieutenant Evelyn Travers, wrote in her diary, "It feels strange to walk along the docks and not see the empty berths where ships should be. The sea, it seems, is no longer on their side." On the night of March 11th, the HMS Hesperus, fitted with a modified Ghost Pulse unit, encountered one of the last aggressive wolf packs west of Ireland. The destroyer's radar picked up 3 faint contacts circling beyond the convoy. The radar operator noted erratic jumps in signal, indicating confusion in the enemy's sensors. Captain Donald McIntyre, a veteran of countless convoy battles, ordered full modulation at once. Within 20 minutes, 2 U-boats surfaced almost simultaneously, believing they had been surrounded. Depth charges followed. The aftermath was grim. The U-boats, later identified as U-744 and U-845, were destroyed. Their survivors hauled aboard, stunned and trembling. One of them, Oberleutnant zur See Heinrich Finke, was interrogated at Liverpool 2 days later. His words were translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, At night we no longer knew where the enemy was. The receiver screamed like a broken machine. We saw ships on the screen that vanished as soon as we turned. We thought we were trapped by invisible destroyers. That confession was added to the growing pile of evidence proving that McElroy's crazy hack had changed the Atlantic War. By April 1944, the transformation was complete. Allied convoys were moving with a confidence unseen since 1939. The U-boat threat had not vanished, but it had lost its terror. A report from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, prepared in early 1945, would later summarize this turning point. The success of anti-submarine radar countermeasures in early 1944 rendered night operations increasingly suicidal for enemy submarines. The phase-modulated pulse system used by British and American escorts contributed materially to the destruction or withdrawal of German undersea forces. Back in Liverpool, McElroy stood on the dock one cold April morning, watching another convoy arrive. Columns of Liberty ships escorted by sleek destroyers whose radar aerials gleamed in the sun. For the first time, he allowed himself to smile. Purvis joined him, hands buried in his coat pockets. Quite a sight, isn't it? A few months ago, this harbour was half empty. Now it's a parade. McElroy nodded slowly. It's not victory yet, he said, but the sea feels quieter. Purvis lit his pipe. You realize history may never know what you did. It'll just say radar improvement or some dull footnote. That's all right, McElroy said. The ocean doesn't keep records. But it remembers. He looked out across the water, where the horizon shimmered faintly under the low sun, and thought of the men below it, both Allied and German, who had fought and died in a war of echoes. The ghost pulse had turned the tide, but it had also changed the sea forever. For now, though, the Atlantic was theirs. Even victory, McElroy knew, never stood still. By late spring 1944, with Allied forces preparing for the Normandy invasion, the German U-boat command, Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, or BDU, began fighting back in silence. Captured records after the war would show frantic development orders from Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters at Kiel, requests for anti-radar coatings, frequency-hopping receivers, and a radical new system known as Naxos ZM. The German scientists at Lorenz and Telefunken had realized the truth. The enemy wasn't simply detecting their radar emissions, they were deceiving them. On a humid night in May 1944, far from those laboratories, the destroyer escort HMS Cotswold sliced through the black swells of the Bay of Biscay. Below decks, Petty Officer Randall Hughes, one of the first trained ghost pulse operators, noticed something odd. "Sir, our modulation's bouncing," he told Lieutenant Jenkins, the radar officer. "Return echoes out of sync by half a beat." Jenkins frowned. "You sure it's not sea clutter?" "No, sir. It's feeding back, almost like someone's copying our signal." Moments later, the radar screen lit up with a duplicate trace, an echo that matched their own emissions perfectly, moving as if in parallel. "Jesus," Jenkins whispered. "They've learned to throw it back at us." The false echo danced across the screen for several minutes, mimicking the destroyer's every maneuver before fading into static. For the first time, Allied radar men realized that the Germans had found a way to mimic the very ghosts that McElroy had conjured. That night, the Cotswold never found her target. A U-boat, later identified as U-763, escaped undetected, slipping beneath the radar horizon. When word reached McElroy in Portsmouth, he wasn't surprised. "It was bound to happen," he told Commander Purvis. "We taught them to see phantoms. Now they're building their own." Purvis sighed. "Can we counter it?" "Not immediately. But we can confuse their copy. If they reflect our signal, we'll distort it further, make their feedback useless." Thus began Operation Whistler, an emergency program to upgrade the ghost pulse modulation into an adaptive system. Engineers experimented with variable pulse lengths, chaotic phase drift, and even the injection of random noise to mask the true radar signature. It was crude, unstable, and deadly to anyone who miscalibrated it. By July 1944, 2 destroyers, the USS England and HMS Havelock, tested the system against returning wolf packs near the Azores. The results were uneven but astonishing. In a debriefing preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency's archives, Lieutenant Robert Hart of the England reported, "Our set went wild for 10 minutes, then locked onto a real contact at 3,000 yards. U-boat surfaced without warning, decks awash, as if they thought they were safe. We never fired a shot. The boat exploded on its own, suspected internal detonation, perhaps panic. Whether panic or error, the encounter proved one thing. The Germans were cracking under invisible pressure." Meanwhile, at Kiel, Oberleutnant Dieter Kummel of the U-1009 wrote in his log, recovered after the war, "Our Metox replaced by Naxos receiver, still impossible to tell real from false echoes. Sometimes the noise sings like a heartbeat. I no longer trust the machine. It lies worse than a man." By midsummer, Allied intelligence intercepted another BDU directive. Surface radar detection unreliable. Crews to rely on visual lookouts. Use radar sparingly. The irony was bitter. The German Navy, once proud of its scientific edge, had been forced back to the oldest weapon of all, human sight. That August, McElroy stood on the pier at Greenock, Scotland, watching as a battered U-boat, U-765, was towed in by a British trawler. Her conning tower was shattered, her periscope bent like a reed. Inside, the crew had surrendered without a fight. He boarded the wreck personally, ducking under the narrow hatch. The air inside was foul, oil, sweat, and rust. In the radio room, he found a Naxos receiver half melted by fire. Next to it, a notebook filled with German shorthand. He couldn't read it, but one line stood out, underlined in pencil. "The night hums. The destroyers sing to us. Then come the explosions." McElroy closed the book, his throat tight. When he returned to shore, Purvis met him with a simple question. "Have we won?" McElroy looked back at the wreck. "We've silenced them," he said. "That's not quite the same thing." By late August 1944, with the Normandy invasion secured and Allied air patrols blanketing the Atlantic, the Great U-Boat War was effectively over. Only isolated submarines remained at sea, hunted relentlessly until they either surrendered or vanished. The once secret crazy radar hack that began in the dim radar shacks of 1943 had evolved into a global network of deception, signals that could lie, mimic, and confuse across half the ocean. Yet, amid the triumph, McElroy couldn't shake one thought. Each improvement, each manipulation of the invisible spectrum made warfare less about courage and more about illusion. He wrote in his notebook before returning to London, "The sea no longer fights fair, neither do we. Perhaps that's why we're winning." He never filed that note officially. But decades later, when it was found among his papers in a faded envelope marked Private, 1944, historians would call it the most honest summary of the electronic war ever written. The Atlantic had grown quieter by autumn 1944. Convoys steamed without fear now, their lights glinting faintly against calm seas. Radar pings no longer meant panic but routine. The escorts, once stretched thin and sleepless, now carried themselves with the easy confidence of hunters who knew the night belonged to them. Yet, in that silence, men like Commander Harold McElroy found no comfort. From his cramped office in Portsmouth, he watched reports trickle in. Enemy contact minimal. Convoy reached destination unopposed. U-boat activity negligible. Each was a line of triumph and a weight. The system he'd helped birth, the ghost pulse, had rendered the ocean almost sterile of conflict. But McElroy wasn't the sort of man who mistook quiet for peace. One cold evening in October 1944, he joined a returning convoy aboard HMS Mountsey. The destroyer's radar operator, a young Welshman named Owen, was barely 20. He'd grown up never knowing the fear of the early Atlantic years, the wolf packs, the blackouts, the long nights when sonar pings could mean death. McElroy stood behind him in the dim radar shack. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "How easy it looks now." Owen smiled faintly. "Feels like we've tamed the sea, sir." "Tamed," McElroy repeated, eyes on the green glowing screen. "That's what they said about the air after we built airplanes." Then someone dropped a bomb from one. Owen didn't answer. Outside, the waves hissed against the hull. Far below that same sea, in a flooded bunker beneath Kiel, the remnants of the German radar command worked in desperation. Allied bombers roared overhead nightly, and their latest invention, H-2S radar, rendered even the clouds treacherous. The scientists knew they couldn't reverse the tide. Still, one engineer, Dr. Wolfgang Reather, scrawled in his lab book, "We began by seeking to see farther. We end by trying to hide from our own inventions." It was the same paradox McElroy faced from the other side of the war. The more clearly they saw, the more inhuman the battlefield became. In November, a message arrived at Portsmouth from the Admiralty. Effective immediately, all radar deception projects to be integrated under Combined Communications Board. Ghost Pulse to be classified top secret. No public disclosure. McElroy understood why. To reveal that Allied ships had not merely detected U-boats, but deceived them, turned the Atlantic into a hall of mirrors, would have invited moral questions no one wanted to ask during victory parades. He signed the final report, locked it in a steel case, and turned the key. That night, in his quarters, he wrote one last private entry. "We won not by sight or steel, but by convincing the enemy to trust the wrong sound. We spoke in echoes until they believed the ocean itself was lying. Perhaps it still is." By early 1945, as Germany collapsed on land, the few remaining U-boats surfaced to surrender. Most were rusted ghosts themselves, their radar gear smashed, their captains weary beyond speech. One such surrender occurred off Bergen in March 1945. The escort ship HMS Calder intercepted U-1024. Her captain, Kapitän-Leutnant Hans Kruger, offered McElroy his binoculars as a gesture of surrender. "They no longer see true," Kruger said in English, tapping his temple. "Your machines, they made us doubt the sea, the stars, even our own ears. That is a worse defeat than death." McElroy took the binoculars but said nothing. When the war ended 2 months later, Ghost Pulse vanished into classified archives. Radar would go on to become the language of airports, weather forecasts and satellites, but its first voice had been born in darkness, whispering lies across the Atlantic. For those who had served in its shadow, the sea would never sound the same again. Years later, McElroy returned to that same coast. The destroyers were gone, the bases quiet. But when the wind blew over the surf, it still carried that faint rhythmic hum, like an echo from somewhere deep and unseen. And he could almost believe the ocean remembered. The war was over, but its frequencies still haunted the air. Across Europe, disbanded radar sites flickered aimlessly on foggy hillsides, their operators gone, their dishes rusting in the salt wind. The technology that had saved convoys and doomed U-boats was now being dismantled, classified and reborn in a new world already preparing for its next invisible conflict. Commander Harold McElroy returned to Portsmouth a changed man. The Admiralty's laboratories were filled now not with wartime engineers, but with young physicists, clean uniforms and polished instruments. They worked on radar for airliners, weather prediction and peacetime navigation. Yet in a locked cabinet in the basement, under the label CW42/GP protocol, lay the original ghost pulse diagrams, the crazy hack that had fooled the Atlantic itself. McElroy often visited that cabinet when no one was watching. He'd trace his fingers along the binder's metal spine, recalling the smell of the radar shack aboard HMS Mountsea, the hum of the cathode tube, the distant thunder of the sea. To most, it was a technical curiosity, an obsolete deception method superseded by modern systems. To him, it was something more dangerous, proof that the human mind could rewrite the rules of perception. In early 1946, the Allied investigation boards met in London to compile a complete record of U-boat losses. The data was staggering. Between January 1943 and May 1945, 631 U-boats had been destroyed, more than half by surface ships using radar guidance. The night, once the U-boat's strongest ally, had become a death trap. At one session, a U.S. Navy analyst named Captain Robert Wilkins presented his findings from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Naval Section. "Our conclusion," he told the room, "is that radar deception contributed not only to kill rates, but to the psychological collapse of the U-boat fleet. Commanders ceased to trust their instruments. They surfaced when they should have dived. They ran silent when they should have fought." He paused, flipping a page. It wasn't just what the Allies saw. It was what the Germans thought we could see. The room fell quiet. Across the table, McElroy exhaled slowly. He had never wanted credit, only understanding. Yet hearing those words spoken aloud felt like a confession the ocean itself had waited to make. Post-war intelligence reports from the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section, ATIS, reinforced what McElroy and Wilkins suspected. Interrogations of captured German officers revealed an extraordinary pattern of paranoia. From the transcript of Kapitänleutnant Ernst Zoller, recorded July 1945. "At night, we would hear the radar crackle. The indicator would show faint blips, then vanish. But when we turned, the destroyers were already there. It was as though they knew our bearing before we did. We thought perhaps they could hear our thoughts." From another, Oberleutnant Karl Becker. "The Atlantic was alive. We would turn off the set to escape the noise, but the noise was inside us." These testimonies, collected and cross-referenced with Allied intercept logs, revealed the scale of psychological warfare that Ghost Pulse had unleashed. For the first time in history, technology had been used not only to see the enemy, but to deceive his perception of reality itself. By 1950, as Cold War tensions deepened, the Ghost Pulse research resurfaced under new names. American and British scientists collaborated on Project Echo, the first radar-based communication system to bounce signals off the moon. The irony wasn't lost on McElroy. What had once been a weapon for hunting submarines was now being used to speak to the stars. Still, the secrecy remained. In classified meetings between the Admiralty and the U.S. Office of Naval Research, Ghost Pulse was cited as the first example of signal conditioning for tactical misdirection. The principle became the seed for modern electronic countermeasures: jamming, spoofing, and radar stealth. The hack that had once fooled U-boats in the Atlantic was now teaching nations how to vanish entirely from the radar screen. In 1962, nearly 20 years after those dark nights off the Azores, McElroy received an invitation to the U.S.-Japanese Aviation History Symposium in Honolulu. It was a reunion of sorts. Scientists, veterans, and engineers gathered to discuss the evolution of wartime technology. Many of them were young men during the war. Now they were professors, directors, and consultants for emerging aerospace industries. McElroy, white-haired but still sharp-eyed, took the stage on the final day. His talk was titled "Illusions in the Fog, the Human Side of Radar." He spoke softly, deliberately. "When we built radar, we thought we were building eyes for machines. In truth, we built mirrors for men. What we learned at sea was that perception is the most fragile weapon of all. He paused, glancing toward a row of Japanese engineers seated near the front. We didn't win the night by force. We won it by distortion, by teaching our enemies to mistrust their own senses. When the session ended, a young Japanese physicist approached him. "Commander McElroy," he said, bowing slightly, "I read about your ghost pulse. Was it real?" McElroy smiled faintly. "Real enough to save convoys, unreal enough to make the ocean doubt itself." The man nodded slowly, as if weighing that sentence against his own work in the new field of electronic surveillance. That evening, on the balcony of his hotel overlooking the Pacific, McElroy lit a cigarette and watched the horizon fade to darkness. The sea was calm, the air warm. Below him, radar dishes at Pearl Harbor swept slowly back and forth, their beams tracing invisible paths through the humid air. He thought of the men he'd known. Captain Ryland, still haunted by the first U-boat his ship had tricked into surfacing. Young Owen, whose trembling hands had once controlled the beam that sealed an enemy's fate. He thought of Kruger, the German captain who'd said surrendering his eyes was worse than surrendering his ship. Some nights, McElroy still heard the echoes, the soft rhythmic hum of pulses rolling across the Atlantic, bouncing back faintly from the years. In his final memoir, published privately in 1965 and never released to the public, McElroy wrote, "It was never about invention, nor even about victory. It was about understanding that the sea is not an enemy, and neither is the dark. We created a light that blinded both sides. And in doing so, we learned that truth and illusion are separated by nothing more than a wave of static." Today, historians studying declassified files at the National Archives and the Naval History and Heritage Command can trace the full arc of the Ghost Pulse operation, from its first field test in 1943 to its silent influence on Cold War radar and stealth technology.